Right, hello, greetings. It's Dr. Thomas Daffern here for my weekly Fasting Sunday talk. And today is the 4th of July, so it's quite an important day in history. I want to talk about history, the first thing I want to talk about today. Most of you know that I love history. You know, I weave history into my talks. I am a historian. I've published loads of books in history. My PhD is in intellectual history. I did a history degree at the University of London. I've taught history for many years. It was through my love of history I got involved in both philosophy and religious studies and peace studies. History began with Herodotus. It simply means inquiry. It means to examine the facts behind allegations and counter-allegations. I mean, Herodotus, one of my first intellectual heroes, was a Greek from Halicarnassus, which is now called Bodrum in Turkey. I've been to that part of Turkey, amazing part of the world. And he was trying to find out why on earth the Greeks and the Persians had gone to war, because it was a horrendous war and it lasted for ages. Lots of people died on all sides. I mean, it's pretty ruthless. And he felt quite rightly that, you know, we should inquire into this. Why? The Persians didn't seem like bonkers. Greeks didn't seem particularly bonkers. So what on earth was going on? That was the beginning of historical inquiry, and it motivated me also in my studies. When I studied the history of ideas, the history of the world, you know, in my history degree at the University of London, I literally took all of world history to be my province, and I used to make really complicated charts. This is pre-internet, pre-computing almost. I would make hand charts of all the great epochs of history. I still have them, handwritten out on graph paper, covering all world history from the beginning of writing, you know, 3000 BC onwards, with then listing all the great thinkers, intellectuals, philosophers, and political leaders and so on, and the conflicts of ideas. Anyway, it all culminated in my PhD, which looked at the history of the lack of peace since World War II, how we got into this position of being able to mutually destroy each other and destroy the planet with the nuclear arms race, and yet, you know, what do we really know about each other? I went to Moscow, I met Russian intellectuals, Russian philosophers. We launched Philosophers of Peace. I became the coordinator, and I ran Philosophers and Historians of Peace in the UK, and then became global coordinator for a while. I'm now sort of vice president, and so this work continues. And I think, therefore, history and philosophy are both needed to study the causes of conflict and the potential solutions to them. And I worked, as you know, at the University of London to create an institute for that sort of work, which is still flourishing, although it's now autonomous. It's based here in France. Today we celebrate Independence Day in America. If you're American, this is a very important day. And, you know, to anyone that's interested in ideas and history, today is significant. I want to quote from the Declaration of Independence. Today, on the 4th of July, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia adopted the Declaration of Independence. That's what we celebrate. And it was written largely by Thomas Jefferson, who was a very great thinker, philosopher. I've studied his writings and ideas. You know, he was in correspondence with many people. Joseph Priestley, who was an English-based Birmingham member of the Lunar Society and had discovered oxygen in Bowood House near Caen in Wiltshire, where I used to teach religious studies at St Mary's School, and Jeremy Bentham used to go down there. He knew Priestley, and they were all members of what's called the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, which was a Freemasonic lodge for intellectuals based in Paris, run by a great French Masonic intellectual called Antoine Cour de Gebelin, who wrote a wonderful multi-volume work called The Primitive World Compared with the Modern World. And it's a really polymathic thing. He looks at etymologies, languages, Druidry, cosmology, mythology, ancient religions. He was from Lausanne in Switzerland originally. He was a bit of a Druid, actually. He was a friend of the Queen. He was a progressive, a radical, but not. He didn't agree with the violent revolution project. He wanted a sort of evolution of ideas. That's why he was involved with the Lodge of the Nine Sisters. They felt that if they could get their ideas correct and reformed, if we could think our way to a better world. He was a true intellectual, Antoine. And he died actually in an experiment, scientific experiment. A lot of these people were scientists. Lavoisier, the great chemist, who also helped discover oxygen with Priestley, he was a member of the lodge. Turgot, the economist, and Benjamin Franklin, who was tinkering around with electricity and had coined negative, positive, All these people were members. Jefferson as well. So I'm going to honour his memory by reading out from his Declaration of Independence. Today we honour that. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organising its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Well, those are revolutionary words, and Jefferson had had enough of the British misrule in the colonial territories in North America, which seemed to him pretty arbitrary. He felt that it was time for the American colonies to assert their right to independence. It's interesting that he says that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are among the unalienable rights. I would agree with him. The right to life means that we have to be for non-violence. The right to life means we can't be killed, or we can't be made as cannon fodder to fight in wars. I mean, what happened to the right to life in World War I when millions of people died? All the little villages of France sent men off to the front, and they were a lot of them killed. The same in Germany and Britain and America. What happened in Russia? Millions of people died. So where's the right to life? Completely ignored. That's why I'm a pacifist who believes, like Tolstoy and Gandhi, that we have to oppose violence. It follows, to me, as night follows day, that the right to life insists we get rid of war as an instrument of foreign policy. That's why I support the International Peace Bureau, the UN, and the other international diplomatic channels to get rid of war. That's why I support the European Union, which has got rid of war among its member states and is pursuing peace diplomacy wherever possible to advance peace strategies in not just on the borders of the European Union but worldwide. It's why it won the Nobel Peace Prize. And there is a big conference coming up for the International Peace Bureau in October in Barcelona, which is a great city dedicated to peace. And just won the Luxembourg Peace Prize for its work for peace. They're trying to get the whole harbour front in Barcelona as a sort of peace walk. So you'd go along and see all the Nobel Peace Prize winners. They would be each having plaques. So you'd do this walk along the seafront, which I think is a great idea. And Barcelona is also trying to get other Mediterranean cities to become peace cities. All of which I support. Let's turn the Mediterranean Sea into a peace sea, So the right to happiness is also very important because, that's, I mean, life is not worth living without the right to happiness. And of course, everyone will have a different take on that. For a pianist, to play a piano is happiness. To a golfer, it's to play golf. For a mother, it's to be with their family and their children, and for a political activist, it's to be active in their political party, campaigning and knocking on doors. I mean, each one of us. That's why human life is so interesting. We have varieties of happiness. For cats, it seems to be limited to eating, sleeping, and sitting and looking at stuff. I mean, it's sort of a bit more limited, but I'm sure cats, they have a great sense of happiness in their own way. So yes, the right to happiness is a wonderful, very visionary kind of bit of wording to add in. Liberty as well. Liberty to me includes liberty of conscience, liberty of freedom of thought. As an academic, I depend on academic freedom to not just to me personally, but for the whole of science, the whole of knowledge, the whole of the organised pursuit of knowledge depends on liberty and freedom of exchange, of publication and criticism and so on, and should be conducted, however, in a certain decorum. I mean, liberty doesn't give me the right to do hate speech or to insult you or anyone. It doesn't give me the right to target other people's nations, races or minorities. This is a mistake that some people on the right make, and it's a catastrophic and tragic mistake. It was made by Hitler in thinking that the liberty of the German people depended on demonizing the Jewish people or the Romanies or the homosexuals or the Poles. They create a whole propaganda warfare against Poland before they invaded in 1939. This isn't liberty. This is, Hitler wasn't an intellectual. He hadn't got a clue what he was talking about, really, and he was just a bought man. The military machine was, using these petty pseudo-intellectuals to rise up a whole generation of populist parties, which unfortunately we're seeing echoes of that, which is why we need to be very cautious and oppose this stuff. By all means, let's all debate with liberty, but let us, as I say, let us contain the discussion within the bounds of civility, concord, and mutual happiness. So anyway, and also about the 4th of July, I mean, the War of Independence, I mean, it's more sophisticated, we need to be a bit more nuanced. I think I mentioned before in these talks that the book Rough Crossings by Simon Sharma, the historian, opened my eyes to the complexity of the War of Independence. The slave communities, the blacks, really didn't benefit from the independence war. If anything, they supported the British because the British actually were against slavery more than the colonial elites who were organising the war. And there is some evidence that, slave owners, I mean, Jefferson was himself a slave owner, although he did liberate them all before he died. He had a love affair with one of his slave women. That was part of their culture. And the British actually abolished slavery before the Americans, considerably before, and non-violently, without a huge civil war over it. So, whose side was God actually on in this War of Independence? I suspect God was on the side of the Quakers, who were refusing to fight and who were trying to get slavery abolished peacefully, and who were trying to talk to the Indian native peoples with integrity and honour and to make peace treaties and so on. They actually influenced, the American Indians influenced the structure of the colonial governance because of the work of Deganawida, the great American Canadian Indian peace leader who lived in that part of the world in about 1300 and had led to the formation of a confederacy of tribes who settled disagreements through mediation and looking at a problem from all angles, diplomacy if you want. So And a lot of the native peoples actually also took the British side. They felt that these rebellious colonialists were only going to make their life worse if they got out of Britain's control, because the British were honouring the peace treaties made by the French with the peoples across the Appalachians. The British had made a deal with the Indian tribes that they wouldn't colonise all those lands. They were honouring the French deal. And whereas the American rebels wanted to tear up those treaties, wanted to colonise the West, wanted to send wagon trains west and take all the Indian lands. And they needed to dishonour those treaties and break up the British North American territories in order to do so. And in fact, Washington himself was a surveyor who was working for the Virginia gentlemen who wanted to colonise across the Appalachians. And there is some evidence, suppressed, of course, that Washington and his cronies, that was one of their main motivations for the war. They used the rhetoric of freedom, but actually they meant steal more Indian land. So from a native people's perspective, again, the history of that rebellion looks a bit different. Because, what happened was, after they won their independence, they then sort of set about promulgating USA Inc., and it set off to colonise and take over all the Indian lands. It did fake treaties, but then carried on stealing the Indian land. And it, some people say that was equivalent to genocide, what they did. The poor native peoples were herded further and further west. They were all rerouted to Oklahoma, where I've been and taught. And I've studied Native American history in some detail. That's why I'm able to share this. I feel a great sympathy for the Native Americans, their ability, and in spite of the fact that they were excluded from their own territories, and pushed into Oklahoma, they kept their dignity and their wisdom. And now there's some amazing Native American teachers around. I'm involved with the Wisdom Keepers Association. We have several Native elders on our in our group, and we're working towards issuing various declarations about what should be done about the state of the world. Where's wisdom gone in all the chaos, right? And, in Canada, things are a little better, but not extremely. I mean, the native people suffered there too, and there's all these discoveries being made about forced schooling, where native peoples in Canada, their children were sent to these, boarding schools, and a lot of them died of disease, neglect. We don't know. There's a load of need for full inquiry into all these things. There is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada looking at it. Trudeau's, supporting that work, and the truth has to come out. What was done to the native peoples in Canada and America was wrong, obviously scandalous. And, we did it to ourselves. I mean, we are those native peoples, as well as the people that did the thing. It's humanity. We can't, there's no point just sort of blaming that bunch of people. It's what we have to do is analyse the ideology that led people to think that that was, good idea. So I think in some ways 4th of July it was a good idea Jefferson had, independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But notice that the Declaration only mentions men. I mean, women don't get a look in. They weren't taken. They didn't have the right to vote. They weren't taken seriously in those days. So there's a lot of fine tweaking to be done to the American Constitution, and we've seen how easy it is in the Trump tragedies to see how easy it is for sort of racist, misogynistic, hate-filled, white supremacists to sort of steal back the American political system in the name of that sort of populist rhetoric that fueled a lot of that original Revolutionary War. So, as a historian, I have to say, look at the small print, guys. Look at the details. Don't just go like a football crowd chanting one side or the other. History is much more complicated, and that's why the Jains always say, Mahavira, who's a kindred spirit, he said, look, when you really look at reality, it's so complicated there's truth on all sides, like a diamond. It has a myriad of facets that you can't say this or that, because they're all true simultaneously, you know. So in the end, you have to adopt non-violence and a strategy of anikanthana, which means suspension of judgment, non-absolutism. You know, the American revolutions were not absolutely right. The British colonialists were not absolutely right. They were both relatively right, but the Quakers had the right thing. They were saying, no, guys, non-violence has to be the way we solve this. And I think that would have been in the true spirit of Christ as well. I mean, these both rebels and colonialists thought they were Christian, you know, whatever they thought they meant by that. Well, I don't think Christ was on the side of violence or war. I don't, that's not my Christ anyway. I don't follow that particular version of Christ. The Christ I follow is a Gnostic, genius, enlightened rabbi who taught the path of universal love, compassion, wisdom and enlightenment. I don't see that can be achieved by volleys of rifles. So anyway, there we are, thank you. That's my little contribution to Independence Day, which hopefully will get you thinking. It's also, now going on with history, you know, history always comes thick and fast. Today is the day on which the Communist Manifesto was published by Marx and Engels. They co-wrote it. It's been a big flurry. Here it is, with a foreword by historian A.G.P. Taylor, who was a great historian, one of my mentors when I was doing my history degree. It opens with the wonderful slogan, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." Now, and Engels added a footnote to that later on. He said, that is what we mean written history. Because Engels was a great fan of so-called primitive peoples, indigenous peoples, primal peoples. He thought they existed in a more communistic way. And he was a great fan of the Iroquois, the Native American peoples. He'd studied them through the works of an anthropologist called Lewis Henry Morgan, who'd spent a lot of time with the native peoples. And they had a much more egalitarian way of living. They lived in big longhouses. They weren't so fussed about private property. They communally owned the fields. They planted the crops together. They had lots of ceremonies. They had just a much more communal sort of way of living and a more shared approach to happiness. So if somebody was hungry, the community would feed them. If somebody was you know, down on their heels, there was always a safety net in the community. So Engels liked these early societies. He felt that capitalism, which was this extreme class distinctions between the very rich and you know, the poor, had come about through historical processes that were ultimately what he and Marx were trying to study and find out what had caused them. And the Communist Manifesto goes into the details. I mean, I'm doing a commentary on Das Kapital, where Marx set out his explanation for how this process happened. And, you know, it's extremely complicated. Why did class struggle replace the early egalitarian, communitarian ways of organising society? I mean, it's still something sociologists, economists and historians and anthropologists can't agree on. But Marx and Engels gave it a good go. They tried to explain it. So we can celebrate, you know, obviously they got lots of things wrong, but we can celebrate the fact that they tried to ask the questions. And I think it's interesting that they published this book on the same day as the Declaration of Independence. It was published on the 18th of March in 1848. You know, it's an important day, therefore, to honour. On the 4th of July, it was also published on this day, so a different edition. There were different editions in England. Probably the first edition was German, and then in on this day, 4th of July, it was published in English translation. You know, it had a complicated publication history. So, also I just want to share, I mean, communism's gone out of fashion, but not entirely. I mean, there were truths in it that social happiness is as important, if not more, well, as important as individual happiness. You can't, you know, I think this was the insight of the Mahayana Buddhists. You can't have individual enlightenment and, like, I'm okay, Jack, I'm enlightened, and, you know, sod you lot, you can go to the devil. I mean, it doesn't work like that, because we're all interconnected. Science knows about the interconnection now, and metaphysics knew about the interconnection now, ever since Mahavira pointed it out, and Buddha. They were like cousins almost, intellectually. You can't really reach, there's no such thing as individual enlightenment, there's a collective, ultimately a collective enlightenment, and that seems to me where communism came from. I think the most interesting communist thinker was actually Moses Hess, who introduced Marx and Engels to each other. They'd never have met without him. He was a young Polish Jewish intellectual who wrote an amazing book. He was in love with Hegel, as am I, and he felt that in the universal mind is the source of true communism. And the purpose of history is to manifest institutions in society, nationally and internationally, that share the commonality of that universal mind, which is Geist, the absolute, in Hegel's system, and it's God in normal old Anglo-Saxon. So if we're all from the one God, if we're all from the universal mind, and that manifests in different religions, I don't care if you're a Muslim, a Jew, a Buddhist, a Hindu, or whatever, a Druid, a Christian, of any denomination, we're all still fragments or elements of that universal mind. So we need society and social institutions that manifest that commonality. What we don't need is institutions whereby tiny numbers of people steal all the wealth, the power, the kudos and the money, and live in like paradise homes, gated and behind barbed wire and with security guards, and the poor people are all out starving with nothing. That's what Moses Hess was saying is metaphysically unacceptable. And he was writing, he wrote that book just before the Communist Manifesto was published. And I think he was a better philosopher than either Marx or Engels. Isaiah Berlin, one of my other great heroes intellectually, from Riga in Latvia, a Jewish savant, made his way to London and was a great liberal intellectual, an influence on Michael Ignatieff, who ran the Liberal Party in Canada for some years, who I have great respect for as well. Isaiah Berlin first drew Moses Hess to my attention as a young student of history. And he always jumped up and down and said, look, read Hess, guys. So, yeah, and the mayor of my local town here in Busak, another early socialist intellectual, was also writing about the spiritual side of communism and critiquing Marx's insistence on pure materialism as an insufficient explanation. You know, if you rule out the metaphysics of communism, it doesn't make any sense. It becomes an excuse for Stalin to just bayonet the opposition. I mean, it becomes a Leninist nonsense. And that's what went wrong with the whole thing. And Mao as well. I mean, there is a joke about Mao being even a communist. I mean, the guy wasn't. He was just a bandit, actually. If you read the biography of Mao, which I've read, you know, there are several really good ones. There's an 800-page biography of Mao in detail that I've read. He was never a proper intellectual or a proper communist. He literally was a bandit hiding in the mountains. He was just a better bandit than the others. And he adopted the slogans of communism to fool people. And the clincher is that years later, after he'd won the Chinese Civil War through underhand methods and barbarism and cruelty, and then he went to Moscow to plead for the atomic bomb from Stalin, and Stalin was very loath to give it to him because Mao struck him as a real barbarian. And Mao was saying things in public debate with Stalin like, yeah, you give us the bomb and we'll attack America with it. We don't care if we lose a few million people. No, we got more people than them. We'll bomb them, they'll bomb us, yeah. You know, lots of people will die, but hey, we've got loads of people in China, we'll win in the end. And Stalin's mouth dropped open. I mean, Stalin, the horrible, cruel guy, was afraid of Mao because of his lack of ethics. Can you believe that? And some people say, the historian who wrote a very detailed biography of Stalin says that contributed to Stalin's final stroke and death. He was so appalled at Mao, who did get the bomb, and, you know, probably that was a mistake. I don't think the Soviets should have given China the bomb myself. I don't think anyone should have a bomb. I'm a supporter of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, get rid of it. So the point was they bugged the dacha where Mao was staying in the suburbs of Moscow, some country place. They bugged it because he was there for a couple of months trying to wheedle the bomb out of them. And at one point, one of the Russian Soviet leaders went to talk to him, and they were chatting, you know, over whatever, sherry or something, probably a vodka, and the Russian guy said, well, look, Mao, you know, let's be honest now, we're alone, and, you know, what do you actually think of Marx? Have you read him? What do you think of Marx? And Mao confessed, he said, to be honest, mate, I've never actually read Marx. I don't know much about him. And that was captured on the tapes. And Stalin, you know, like, guffawed when he read it. I mean, Mao was honestly saying, look, I'm not actually a Marxist. I don't know anything about communism. I just use it as a slogan to be a better bandit. When will the Chinese people realise they've been hoodlummed, you know? They haven't had their Solzhenitsyn moment. They haven't had their wakey moment yet. You know, there's something in the Chinese character that defers to authority, and when the bandits steal power, well, they're still an authority, so we've got to give them, you know, kowtowance. But I don't agree with that. I'm an intellectual who believes in, like Jefferson, in freedom of thought and truth. And if this is true, you know, what I'm saying about Mao, then it needs to come out. And the Chinese people have to confront this in their own time. So it's a mixed thing. Again, this is a nuanced historian speaking here, you know, that yes, we celebrate the, you know, the Communist Manifesto, but we also lament some of the ways that it's been misused in history and became a totalitarian tool to oppress peoples. I mean, this is going to be the theme of this talk, unfortunately, is the way that what seems to be good can become subverted and turned into something pretty evil. What is it in human nature that does this? There seems to be this moral entropy that sets in. How can we resist that individually? What is the opposite to moral entropy? Is there a moral goodness vaccine that we can all have, or a moral goodness charge or booster? That's kind of, you know, what I'm going to be coming back to and asking. I want to just say that on the positive front, the communist revolution in Russia was very stirring for many people. And recently I watched the amazing film Reds by Warren Beatty, and starring Diane Keaton and Warren Beatty himself, which recapitulates the life of Jack Reed, who was the only American in Russia at the time of the revolution to witness the events firsthand. He got to know Lenin, he interviewed